So I was under the impression that the TM-2 could only use 2 triggers because, you know, the name TM-2. But it turns out that you can actually use 4 triggers, and it therefore makes this little unit way more powerful. So to get this working is actually really simple and actually really easy. So first thing, the only things you'll need to add to the TM-2 are 2 splitter cables, so a Y-split cable. Now for this video, I'm literally using like a big jack, and make sure it's got the 2 black lines because that means it's a TRS cable, which is essentially a stereo cable that goes to 2 mono jacks. Now the reason I use this rather than like a jack splitter is because I've had way more luck with this than I have using a splitter. I presume it's just how the cable works, because a splitter generally goes from stereo to 2 stereo, whereas this goes stereo to 2 mono, and that's the important thing. If you'd like a link to these exact cables that I'm using, there's a link in the description. I just got them on Amazon, and I know how annoying it is to try and find cables for things like this that actually work, so you can grab them in the link just down below in the description. But just get 2 of these because, you know, 4 triggers, and that's it. The only last thing I will say about these cables is that make sure you get ones that you can actually separate the jacks as much as you can, because if you're limited to having only, say, this much separation, then suddenly you have to have your triggers next to each other, and yeah, and you don't want that. Speaking of which, up next, the only other thing you'll need is 4 triggers. So in this video, I'll be using 2 PD8s, a BT1 and a KT10 on the floor. So that's where you can now see why you need a bigger splitter, because I'm going from the BT1 up here to the KT10, which is down on the floor next to my bass drum. You don't have to have these exact triggers. You can have 4 triggers of your choosing. They don't even have to be Roland. Just for this video, it gives us a nice sort of scope of different triggers. After that, you'll just need to put samples on the triggers, and for that you can either use the built-in ones to the TM2, or I actually made a little video up here on where you can get more samples should you want to build that little sample bank. So up next is actually setting up the triggers in the TM2 so it detects 4 rather than 2. And the big thing that I don't like about the TM2 is how annoying it is to use on the menus, where you have to press multiple buttons at the same time, and it's really annoying. And if you'd like to see my full opinion on the TM2 and whether I think you should buy it, again, you can check out the video just up here. But with that, the first thing we're going to do is plug in the triggers. Now, again, it doesn't matter what order as long as you know which one you're plugging into. For me, I did the 2 PD8s in inputs 1 and 2, and then the BT1 and the KT10 into trigger inputs 2 and 3. Now on the TM2, this will just be trig in 1 and trig in 2, but obviously we're plugging in 4 triggers to those inputs. So once you plug them in, to actually select the trigger, we need to do a few things. And this is where I was saying about the buttons, we have to press multiple at the same time, and it's a whole thing. So you want to press the Shift and Inst button, and that'll get you to the setup menu. Once you're here, press the plus button to go into trigger setup, and this is where it kind of gets a little confusing. So each trigger input has pad times 2 or head and rim. So we can press the 1 button, as we can see, it goes to 1 HR, and then you want to press the plus button to make that pad times 2. Now to check that that's worked, we can just hit the pads, 1 and then 2, and there we go. We have 1 flashing on each trigger, but that means they're both coming through. And then same thing for trigger input 2, where we can just press the 2 button and then use the plus or minus to change that from head and rim to pad times 2. What you want to do after this is just press the next arrow key, and this is where you're going to get to the trig setup, and this is where you're going to select which triggers are there. So obviously for the PD8s, 1R is trigger input 1, so that's PDA. 1H is the next one, so that's 1 head, 1 rim, and again, PDA. Now the BT1 is where it gets interesting. If you're using a BT1 as well, you want to make sure you do this, where you don't want to select just BT1 because it's a dual trigger. You actually want to select BT1 sends, and that basically just means it'll work as a single trigger rather than a dual one, and it'll actually work. So one of those weird Roland settings that it's just there, and we have to deal with it. So there we go. And then obviously KT10 is going to be KT10. So unlike something like the SPDSX, you can actually label all of these triggers to the triggers that they are. All of them should work with sort of the built-in settings. That means you don't have to mess with the sensitivity and thresholds. But if you did want to do that, or say some of the triggers are misfiring, you can check out the video up here on how to set that so the triggers stop misfiring. Now from here, we plugged in our triggers, we've got the settings, we actually want to put a sample to that trigger. So to do that, on the back of the main menu, and you can press the Inst button if you're still in the menus to go all the way back to the kit. We're then actually going to press the Inst button again, and that's going to bring us to our triggers. So we can hit a trigger, that's going to bring it up, and then we can just use the plus or minus to select our sample, and you want to do this on all of the triggers. So press Inst, hit the trigger, use the plus or minus buttons to select your sample. And then once you've done that, you can hit Inst to go back to the new kit, and you can play your triggers. So if you're interested in joining our little Patreon group, you can click the link in the description down below, where you can also find all the links to basically everything I've used in this video. And with that, I hope you enjoy playing 4 triggers with the TM-2.